Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Jazakumullah khairan, everyone, for coming out again. Inshallah, we can benefit somewhat from, at the very least, each other's company, bringing people together. May Allah bless the people who are really behind making these things happen for all of us. Ameen, inshallah. So, the first thing I want to say is, of course, we're all thinking about one particular issue at this time. Everyone in the Ummah is on the same page. Everyone in the Ummah is thinking about our brothers and sisters in Gaza and Palestine right now. And I'm not going to talk about that this time. And I know sometimes people want us to address what's going on right now. But in order to really understand what's going on right now, we need to know our history. That's one of the purposes of this whole lecture series. We need to know where we're coming from. We need to know, have some kind of grasp on more than just the last 5 days of what's happened in the Ummah in order to understand how we're supposed to react to these things. So inshallah, we're going to benefit overall from this series when it comes to this kind of event and many more events to follow in our lives. More specifically, next week, inshallah, we will actually be talking about the conquest of Jerusalem under Umar ibn Khattab, and we will talk a little bit more in detail and get a little bit more background, a pretty good background, inshallah, as to how to think about what's going on in that part of the world today, inshallah. So today, we're going to be talking about the Seerah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And right off the bat, I'm going to say one of the main purposes of this lecture, one of the main reasons why we need to study the history of the Ummah is because, alhamdulillah, especially in America, I would say, at least in my experience, we get a pretty thorough study of the Seerah throughout our lives and in all of our communities. And that's one of the, I don't want to say complaints when it comes to studying the Seerah. Studying the Seerah is essential, it's vital, it's the foundation of everything. If you don't know the Seerah, if you don't have the resources that really enable you to love Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then nothing else is going to work out in terms of your engagement with Islam. But I would argue that too often we go through the Seerah, we learn about all of the events of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba, we get to the death of the Prophet ﷺ, we learn something about the Khilafah of Abu Bakr, a little bit more about the Khilafah of Umar radiallahu anhuma. We learn maybe something about the beginning of Uthman, and then we stop there. Next thing you know, it's the 1980s, Muslims are arriving in America, and we're learning about what our parents were doing in the last generation, and there's that 1,000 years of history in between that we don't know almost nothing about, most of us. And so for this lecture, we're going to learn about the Seerah. You have to. There's no skipping the Seerah if you want to know something about Islamic history. But it's not going to be anywhere near the detail that most of you already probably know as it is. Right? We have to cram. This was probably the most difficult lecture to put together in this series because you have to cram the whole Seerah into 1 hour. People have spent months and years going through the Seerah, and that's, we'll see, inshallah, how that works out for us. So I'm not going to give details of the Seerah here. If you want them, inshallah, there's so many resources. There's so many good books out there. There's so many great lecture series on the Seerah. People like recommendations. My favorite book on the Seerah in English is called Muhammad by Martin Lings. I think the subtitle is His Life Based on the Earliest Sources. Fascinating, fabulous English work on the Seerah. I recommend it to everyone who's interested in reading a really good English language Seerah. And then, of course, probably the best resource that we have in English available to everybody right now is Sheikh Yasir Qadhi's series on the Seerah on YouTube, wherever people listen to that. An excellent resource when it comes to getting the actual details and a real discussion of the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So we have those resources. What we're going to do here, what my plan is for this, is inshallah to try and highlight maybe some of the less known facts around the seerah, to try and talk about some of the interesting meaning parts of the seerah that might not be as well discussed, that don't show up as often in our analysis of the Prophet's life. And also to try and focus on the parts of the seerah where the Prophet ﷺ is setting up the rest of Muslim history. The Prophet ﷺ, from the beginning of his message, knows where this religion is going. He knows this is not a religion for the people of Mecca. This is not a religion for Arabia. This is a religion for the world. And he makes all the appropriate moves to establish a religion that's going to spread well beyond his life, well beyond his community. So we're going to try to focus on those aspects of the seerah here. One more note. I have to apologize. I will be looking at my notes a lot for this because there's a lot in the seerah. Right? In any other lecture, I can memorize a general story and I can give you the facts that I've learned in whatever order I want to. But when it comes to the seerah, all of you know as much as I do about the seerah, and I have to make sure that I'm hitting the main points. And so this is going to be kind of a note-heavy lecture. Okay, we'll dive in then, inshallah. So, Bismillah, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless any attempt that we have at learning something about His beloved, our messenger, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's nothing more dear to any Muslim community. There's nothing more beloved in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than people coming together to learn about His messenger. I want to start off by immediately contradicting what I said in last week. Not that I'm changing anything, I still agree with pretty much everything I said in our last lecture. But one of the main points that I was emphasizing in that lecture was to say that Muslim history and secular world history need to be united in our minds, that we've spent too long thinking about these two views of our past as being separate, as existing in somehow different parallel worlds, and that we need to bring these aspects of our identity and our experience together. That we need to know that the Prophet ﷺ was functioning in the same world as the Romans and the Chinese and every other civilization that we spend so much more time talking about in our secular world history classes. But, and this is where the contradiction comes in, there's no denying that the history of our ummah has a very otherworldly foundation. There's no getting around the fact that the history of our ummah begins with angels coming out of the sky and bringing revelation to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The Quran is not a historical document. A historical document or a historical event is something that you can go back into the record and you can find it, and then you can go back further and you can see what built up and led to it, and then you can see what events occurred following it. With the Quran, there's no build-up. There's no series of events. There's no path that we can work back through and try to understand where this Quran came from. Either you believe that it came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that it was given to Jibreel, that Jibreel alayhi salam carried it to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam taught it to his community, and that community has continued to teach it down the generations until it gets to us. Or you believe that somebody wrote it, the Prophet ﷺ, or some rabbi or priest, or it was found in the records of an ancient civilization, whatever other theories are out there. At that point, there's a dividing choice. You either choose to believe in the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, in which case you are part of this ummah, or you choose not to. You choose not to believe in the revelation aspect. Right? There is an otherworldly start to the history of this ummah. And there's no getting around that. There won't be any agreement between people who believe and people who don't believe on that topic. So that's one of the things that I want to talk about a little bit here, is that in order to do what I was saying in the last lecture, to bring these histories closer together and to unite these views of the world that we have, you don't have to throw out all of the aspects of our religion that require iman. We should not. That would be that would disunite those histories that we need. You still need to believe in angels. You still need to believe in jinn. You still need to believe in miracles. You still need to believe that the same Prophet ﷺ that sent armies against the Romans and that conquered large parts of the world and developed this civilization that everybody is going to be talking about for the next 1400 years, also took a trip on a spectacular steed from Mecca to Jerusalem in a single night, and then traveled up into the heavens with an angel. You need to believe that both of those things are true, and we shouldn't be disturbed. We shouldn't be dissuaded by the fact that we're trying to make this sound like a real history. This is a real history. This is the most real history, right? So there's a wonderful story that I've always loved that I think is a great way of beginning our discussion here. And it's a story that occurs during the Khilafah of Umar ibn Khattab, radiallahu anhu. At some point, he was in Medina. The story is narrated by his son, Abdullah bin Umar. Abdullah bin Umar says, one day, I was sitting with my father, and he starts by commenting, he says, I never saw my father say, such and such is true, except that such and such ended up being true. Right? He's talking about both the truthfulness and the basira, the insight, the knowledge that his father had. And he gives an example. He says, one day, I was sitting with my father, and we saw a man walking down the street of Medina. And my father, Umar ibn Khattab, said, as soon as he saw the man's face, he said, either this man is still on the religion of his forefathers, meaning he's a munafiq, right? Either meaning that he's still practicing paganism, but he's doing it in secret, or when he was on the religion of his forefathers, he was one of the fortune tellers of his community. So he sees something, we don't know what it is that he sees, but he sees something in this man's face that tells him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses certain people with this basira, with insight, the ability to look at someone and to see some kind of true knowledge. So he looks at him and he sees either he is still practicing paganism, or when he was a pagan, he was a fortune teller, right? He was somebody who, the fortune tellers were people who had contact with jinn. This is a real thing that was going on in Arabia. They would form a connection with a jinn, and they would get information from that jinn and try to use that information to tell the future, right? So Abdullah bin Umar has to know. He says, immediately, I had to know if my father was correct. So he goes to the man, and he brings him to Umar ibn Khattab, and he asks him, are you really a believer? Do you really believe in Islam? Are you hiding something else? The man says, in all my days, I have never heard anything as offensive as this. How could you ask me this question? And Umar ibn Khattab says, it's okay. Don't get offended. Were you a fortune teller? Because it's one of these things. Either you were a fortune teller or your iman, there's something wrong with your iman here. And the man says, in all my days, I've never heard anything as amazing as this. Right? How could you know this? I was a fortune teller. I was the fortune teller of my tribe. And Umar ibn Khattab says, tell me the most interesting thing that your jinn ever told to you. And that shows, alhamdulillah, the inquisitive nature of the Sahaba. They weren't like, don't tell me about that, I don't want to know about this stuff, that has to do with jinn, I'm just going to stick with what I know, my salah. No, he was interested, right? This is not something this guy is doing anymore. There's no sin going on here, but he wants to know, what was the most interesting thing your jinn ever told you? The man said, my jinn was a female jinn, and one day we were in the market, and I was in the marketplace of my tribe, and she came to me and she was panicked, and she started saying, have you heard the news? Have you heard the news? And he actually quotes her, and it's from this hadith. And just as a note, even though the Prophet ﷺ at this point has passed away, you still have hadith. The stories of the Khulafa Rashidun are also, not all of them, but some of them are still categorized as hadith. That's just a hadith science question. So from this hadith, we actually get a sample of what jinn speech sounds like. Jinn speak our languages. They can speak Arabic or English. They practice our religions, right? You have jinn who are Muslim or Christian or Jewish. They follow in the communities of the people that they happen to live near. So this jinn is speaking Arabic, but they don't speak just like us. They have a different way of speaking. I don't know the actual lines, but from this we can get a sample of what jinn speech sounds like, which in and of itself is fascinating. So he's quoting her. She comes to him and she's saying, "Have you heard the news? Have you heard the news?" She's in a panic. And he says, "What's going on?" And she tells him all of the jinn are in disarray. They don't know what to do after they've been driven out of the skies, and now they're just wandering through the desert following the camels and their riders. They don't know what to do. And she says, "Something is coming, something is coming, something is coming." And then she runs away from him and he never sees her again. Right? And Umar al-Khattab says, "I know that this is true, because one day, many years ago, I was sleeping in the Haram in Mecca. And I was sleeping in front of one of the idols. And someone came and they brought a calf and they slaughtered it in front of the idol. And all of a sudden, we heard this terrible scream, the most terrible voice I've ever heard. And it screamed out and it said, 'Oh, you evildoer, a moment of victory is coming, and the messenger has arrived.'" And Umar says, a couple days later, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ came out and announced that he had been given revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these two stories, they capture for us this moment right before Islam is introduced to the human community, when the jinn had already been made aware that a messenger was coming, that everything was about to change. The Quran tells us that when the revelation comes to Muhammad ﷺ, the jinn who used to be able to go into the heavens, there was a certain station that they used to be able to reach. They couldn't go all the way up into the heavens where all of the angels were, but there was a station that they could reach, and from that station they could listen to the discussion of angels in the higher levels of the heavens. And that's how they would give information to their fortune tellers. That's how they would be able to tell the future, is they would be listening to the conversation of angels. And angels, the Quran tells us, would sometimes, some of them would get glimpses of the qadr of Allah and they would discuss it amongst themselves. So sometimes the jinn would overhear these discussions from the angels. They would find out something that's going to happen in the future, and then they would go and they would give it to a fortune teller, which is why these fortune tellers were sometimes able to actually tell the future, because the jinn are telling them things that they heard from the angels. But the Quran tells us, once the revelation begins, the revelation of the Quran to Muhammad ﷺ begins, that door is shut. And the angels drive the jinn out of that place that they used to be able to occupy. And the jinn are cut off from being able to eavesdrop on those conversations. And so this sends the world of jinn into disarray. So the jinn know about the coming of Muhammad ﷺ before the human community. And of course, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is sent as a messenger. He tells us that he was sent as the prophet of people and nas and jinn, that he's actually the prophet to both of these communities. And there are fascinating stories surrounding that inshallah, if you're interested, you can look deeper into, inshallah. So this shows us that as much as we want to build a grounded history of our ummah here, there's a lot more going on here than is ever going to be acceptable in the history books that we teach in our social studies classes. But we can't throw that out. We can't forget those parts of our history. Besides the jinn, one of my favorite aspects, of course, Every aspect of the seerah is beloved to all of us. But one of the most interesting aspects of the seerah to me is that moment at the beginning when you learn about all of these people who have been waiting for so long to meet the Prophet ﷺ. We look back on the Prophet ﷺ, we take him for granted. He is the leader of our ummah. His teachings are ubiquitous throughout our communities. We love him, but very often we forget just how blessed we are to be part of the ummah of Rasulullah ﷺ. And we're reminded of that by looking at these stories of all of these people before the coming of the Prophet ﷺ who were anxiously waiting, wishing that they would be part of the Prophet's great community. And I want to go through some of the stories of those people to give us an idea of that build-up, that anticipation that we see in history. Some of the most interesting of those people are called the Hunafa. The Hunafa were a group of people in Mecca, in Arab pagan society, who, for one reason or another, were able to identify that the religion that their people were practicing now is not the true religion, and it's not the true religion even of their people. Right? The Quraysh constantly argue, we see these claims throughout the seerah, we see them preserved in the Quran, that we're doing this because this is the religion of our forefathers and we're going to stay on the religion of our forefathers. We see this argument in our own society today. People argue, why do you want to change the way things are? Just leave things as they are. This is how our community was. We've been doing it all this time. It's stable. Don't mess with it. Don't rock the boat. And the Quraysh say this all the time. We are on the religion of our forefathers. Why are you trying to take us away from this? And the Hunafa were people who were able to correctly identify, even this argument that you're making is not correct. The religion of our forefathers is the religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And you guys changed that religion. Your forefathers came after Ibrahim alayhi salam and tortured that religion and confused it and complicated it and added in all of these idols and everything else that you do. And you're not even following the real religion of your forefathers. So these Hunafa were able to identify, without having a prophet, without having a great deal of knowledge, that there's something that we're missing here that we need to recapture. Right? We need to go back to Ibrahim alayhi salam. And there's 4 of them. There's this great story where the Quraysh would hold a huge festival at certain times in the year. One point in particular, they hold this great festival and they hold it outside of the city of Mecca. And they invite all the other tribes and people gather and they camp and they're there for 3-4 days a week and they do all the things that you do in a festival, or that they would do in a festival. And everybody from Quraysh left Mecca and went out into the desert to be part of this festival, except for 4 people. And each of these 4 people thought that I'm going to be the only one left in Mecca. I don't want to announce anything to the people. I don't want to be ostracized by my people, but I don't want to go and join them in this festival of shirk. So I'm going to stay in Mecca and nobody's going to know because I'm going to be by myself. And when the whole city is emptied out, they realize each of them realizes that there's 3 others, right? The 4 of them are left together. And as soon as they see each other in the abandoned city of Mecca, they realize we're all on the same page here, aren't we, right? You don't actually believe in this religion of that your people are practicing. I don't believe it. And they come together and they start to talk about this. And the 4 people, one of them is a man named Qus ibn Sa'id Iyad. Qus ibn Sa'id is actually not from Quraysh. He's from a tribe called Iyad. And he was a poet. He was the poet of this tribe. And the Prophet ﷺ will actually meet him when the Prophet ﷺ is young and when Qus is old. The other one is probably the most famous of all of them. His name is Waraqah ibn Nawfal. Everybody should know, inshallah. The cousin of Khadija radiallahu anha. Waraqah ibn Nawfal is the first man to recognize that the Prophet ﷺ is a prophet. He's the first one to teach the Prophet ﷺ about what a prophet is and to tell him about what's going on. And then the third man is a man named Ubaydullah ibn Jahash. He's a cousin of the Prophet ﷺ. He's a cousin, but he's a generation older than the Prophet ﷺ. And the fourth, or there are 5 here. The fourth is Uthman ibn al-Hawarith, and the fifth is Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufayl. Right, so there are four of them. Qus is not actually one of the ones in Mecca. I'm reading my list wrong. Qus is another of the Hunafa, but he's not in Mecca, so he's not one of those four that's gathered together. It's Zayd ibn Amr, Uthman ibn Huwayrith, Ubaydullah ibn Jahash, and Waraqah ibn Nawfal. They're the four that find themselves alone in Mecca. And the four of them, they make a deal together. They say, we're going to go out and we're going to find the true religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam. We know this in our hearts, but we don't have any knowledge. We're illiterate Arabs living in the desert. We don't have anything to go off of here except what we really feel in our souls. So they say, we're going to go out into the world and we're going to find this religion. And they set out and they travel beyond Arabia. They leave Arabia, they travel through the Persian Empire, they travel through the Roman Empire, they educate themselves, they learn to read in Farsi, and they learn to read in Greek, and they learn to read Latin. All of them become very educated. Three of them actually convert to Christianity. Waraqah ibn Nawfal and Ubaydullah ibn Jahash and Uthman ibn Huwayrith. They all become Christian. Zayd ibn Amr is the only one that he goes, he meets the Jews, and he says, you're close, but you're not on the religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam. He can tell. Right? This is not really the religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam, so I'm not going to accept that. He meets the Christians and he says, you guys are maybe even a little closer, but you're still not on the religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam. There's still something missing. And he says, I'm not going to be a pagan, I'm not going to be a Christian, I'm not going to be a Jew. He just sticks, he says, I'm going to be a Hanif, and I'm waiting until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala really shows us our way back to the true religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam. The other three become Christian. Uthman ibn al-Hawarith never returns to Arabia. He stays in Rome. He actually becomes a pretty high-ranking member of the Roman government. He becomes Christian. He joins their government. He becomes a translator in the palace of Caesar. This is a generation before the Prophet ﷺ. And he never returns to Arabia. We don't know what happens to him after that. Waraqah ibn Nawfal and the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, Ubaydullah ibn Jahsh, return to Mecca. They're Christians, and they start preaching their religion, but they're not actively trying to convert anybody. They become respected members of the community simply because of their education. They're able to read and write, and they're able to speak multiple languages. And for the most part, the community chooses to leave them alone. They're these crazy guys who follow this religion that we don't have anything to do with. Right? Zayd ibn Amr insists on challenging his community. Really fascinating character, Zayd ibn Amr. He continually challenges the Quraysh, continually tells them, you guys are doing everything wrong. You're so corrupt in all of these ways. You abuse your poor. You abuse your women. You abuse your children. You're this striated society that is very class-based and has all of these difficult power structures, and your religion encourages you to be violent and it encourages you to be harsh, and he just keeps fighting them. And finally they say, look, we can't deal with you anymore. If you don't want us to kill you, leave the city. So he goes just outside of Mecca and he builds himself a home on the outskirts of Mecca, and he lives more or less in exile from his tribe. And he takes up a very fascinating, very beautiful practice. One of the things that he really hates about the practices of Quraysh is the fact that they bury their daughters. Right? That when they have a daughter, they say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has dishonored me by giving me a daughter instead of a son, and they take the baby girl out into the desert and they bury her. This is not as common a practice among Quraysh as it is among other tribes, but some of them would still do this, and he hated this practice. So he says, anybody in Quraysh who has a daughter that they don't want, don't bury her, give her to me, I'll take care of her, I'll raise her. And he starts raising... Do you have a technical problem? You want me to use this one instead? So he... Is this working?
I hope so.
So he takes these girls and he raises them. And he does this 4, 5, 6 times in his life, where he takes these daughters that are unwanted by their families, adopts them, he raises them, And this shows, subhanAllah, the beauty of his character, and it shows the darkness of pagan religion. Especially today, we see a lot of people who like to talk about how wonderful and eco-friendly all of these pagan religions around the world are. That's almost never the case. Pagan religions, there's a lot of darkness in there. There's a lot of oppression that are built into these pagan religions. There's a lot of violence in them. And the Quraysh show us that example quite well. And Zayd ibn Amr shows the beauty of resisting that kind of tradition. So these are some of the people who are anticipating the coming of the Prophet Muhammad. Other people among them, we know the story of Salman al-Farisi, a Persian who's growing up in the heart of the Persian Empire, who finds Christianity and has to flee the Persian Empire. He ends up becoming a high-ranking priest in the Roman Empire, and he goes, you should, if you don't know his story, learn it. It's one of the most beautiful stories of the Sahaba. He travels around, he finally gets a teacher who sends him to Arabia telling him, a prophet is coming, go and find that prophet. This is the one that's going to save our religion. This is one that's going to save Christianity. This is the true prophet that is coming. One of the most interesting moments that is not very well known in this kind of preamble, this lead up to the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, is a record that we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you don't know what those are, the Dead Sea Scrolls are a set of ancient manuscripts that were dug up in Palestine about 40, 50 years ago. So relatively recently. They were dug up, and it turned out that they were the writings of a relatively small community that had taken as one of its main principles the idea that there were prophets that were going to come, there was a new revelation that was going to come that was going to change the religion of Judaism. And it seems that they had to move away from the rest of the Jewish community in Palestine at the time, and live in somewhat of isolation because of their beliefs. And one of the documents in the record, it's called the Damascus document. It talks about how there are two prophets that we're waiting for, because these Jews lived before Isa. And they say there are two prophets that we're waiting for. All the rest of the Jewish community are waiting for one Messiah to come. They say no, there's two more coming. And each one is going to bring about a needed change in our community, in our religion. One of them is going to come from the priest class, and one of them is going to come from the common people. This is how they describe it in those documents that have been translated. And they say with each of these prophets, with both of these prophets, their births will be announced by the rising of a star. Right? This is not in Muslim tradition. We don't have any records of these discussions, but this is what's written in those documents. And it's confirmed. We probably everybody knows the general Christian story that when Isa Islam is born, there's a star over Bethlehem. That's the whole kind of nativity story, and the wise men are guided to Bethlehem, to the place of the birth of this new prophet, by this star that's shining in the sky. That's the general Christian story. Again, there's no Muslim records that talk about any of this. But there is a story that we find in the Seerah that does confirm at least half of this story. And it's a story that is, it's recorded by Ibn Ishaq, who's one of the main, is the first person to write a Seerah. He's from the Tabi'een, a great scholar, who is the first one to actually write a Seerah of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And he records this story, and he says that it's narrated by Hassan ibn Thabit, who's a Sahabi from Medina. He says, when I was a young boy, Hassan ibn Thabit is just a little bit older than the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. He says, when I was a young boy, I remember one night being woken up and hearing one of the Jews of Medina shouting from a rooftop, saying, "O community of Jews, come and hear what I have to say." And then all of the Jews come out of their houses to hear what this man is yelling about, and they ask him, what's the issue, what's happening? And he says, I have seen this night the star of Ahmed rise, and now is the coming of the second prophet that we were promised. So Hassan ibn Thabit is narrating that the Jews in Medina were looking for that star. They were looking for that symbol, and it comes right around the time that the Prophet ﷺ is born. Hassan ibn Thabit is about 7-8 years older than the Prophet ﷺ. He was about 7 or 8 years old when he narrates this story. He says, the star of Ahmed has risen. So the Jewish community is another one of those communities. They're waiting for that prophet. They're looking out for that prophet. All of these people all around the world, in the human communities, in the jinn communities, everybody is looking for this Prophet ﷺ. We, alhamdulillah, happen to be blessed to be born into the community of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. A blessing that so many people wanted, very few people were able to receive. Even if we look back at the 4 Hunafat in Mecca, of them, Warqa bin Nawfal meets the Prophet ﷺ. Right? When he becomes a prophet, tells him that he's a prophet, because the Arabs didn't have a concept of what a prophet was. They didn't even have this word, Nabi. Right? They knew the word, but they had no idea what that was. It wasn't a concept that they used. You see this repeated very often in the Seerah. Prophet ﷺ will say, I am a Nabi, and somebody will say, Wama Nabi. What is a Nabi? I don't even understand this. So the Arabs didn't have that concept. But Warqa bin Nawfal is a Christian. He knows what a prophet is. He knows about the stories of the prophets who came before. He's able to introduce the Prophet ﷺ to that. But then he dies very shortly after. So he's a Sahabi, he's a Muslim, but he dies almost immediately after this conversation that he has with the Prophet ﷺ. Zayd ibn Amr passes away before the Prophet ﷺ becomes a prophet. He meets the Prophet ﷺ when he's an old man and the Prophet ﷺ is young, but he isn't there by the time the revelation comes. His son is a great companion. And his son later asks the Prophet ﷺ, you met my father, you knew what his condition was. What's his state in the Akhirah? The Prophet ﷺ says, when I went on the Mi'raj, when I went up into Jannah with Jibreel, I saw your father. And he is a person who will come on Yawm al-Qiyamah as an ummah unto himself. Right? This is the man who raised all of those daughters from the Quraysh, who never gave up challenging his community, who never accepted any truth except the truth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed in his heart. Prophet says he is his own ummah. He's the only person, as far as we know, who will come on Yawm al-Qiyamah, who will be an ummah without a prophet. Every other ummah has a prophet leading them. He is his own. It's a beautiful and amazing status to uphold. The saddest of those stories is the story of Ubaydullah bin Jahsh, who was the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, who had converted to Christianity. When the Prophet ﷺ brings the revelation, he accepts Islam, he converts to Islam, he migrates with the other Sahaba and go to Abyssinia, and then when he's in Abyssinia, he reverts to Christianity and he stays in Abyssinia. So he was somebody who strove for the truth all his life. In the end, he couldn't accept it when he found it. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to let us always accept the truth when He brings it to us, whatever form it comes in. So, this is the preamble to the Seerah of the Prophet. Just that preamble has taken up nearly all of our lecture here. It's impossible to give the full Seerah of the Prophet Muhammad without, in such a short period of time. But we can very quickly, inshallah, just give the outline of that. And then, alhamdulillah, there are so many resources available to us if we want to know those details further. Of course, the Prophet ﷺ grows up in Mecca. He grows up an orphan. The Seerah is divided into pretty simple parts to follow. There's the life of the Prophet ﷺ before he becomes a prophet. He receives revelation when he's 40 years old. At the time when he receives revelation, I believe it's the year 610 in the Gregorian calendar. And then, of course, the persecution of Muslims begins in Mecca. The Prophet ﷺ lives for 13 years his prophethood, building the new Muslim community in Mecca. And there's so many lessons, an infinite number of lessons to be learned from the Seerah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, but particularly from this balance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us between the time and the nature of the Muslim community as they exist in Mecca, versus the nature of the Muslim community as it exists and develops in Medina. So the Prophet ﷺ is in Mecca for 13 years, preaching to his community, trying to bring the Quraysh over. And then when he reaches a point where he can no longer survive living in Mecca, when his uncle Abu Talib passes away and he loses the protection of his tribe, his uncle Abu Lahab becomes the head of Banu Hashim, becomes the head of his tribe, and tells him, I'm removing protection from you. And there's a lot to learn here for us. There's a lot of lessons to learn here for us. But historically speaking, there's a very important lesson that we need to grasp, that we tend to think of ourselves as living in a world that has states and laws and citizenship, and it's not just a free-for-all, and everything before the formation of the nation states that we live in now was just this free-for-all where anybody could kill each other at any time. That's not how it worked. You had basically the same systems in play. Not exactly the same systems, but the same effects. Right? There's always some means of somebody guaranteeing you protection. Right? We have a certain degree of protection because of our citizenship in this country or in another country. There are people in the world today who don't have citizenship in any country. And those truly are people who can be abused by anyone. No one's going to stand up for them. No one's going to stick up for them. We learn something about the way that politics in the world works today just by looking at the microcosm of how politics worked between the tribes in Arabia. There's a size difference, but there isn't much else different in the way that these entities work in the world. And so when the Prophet ﷺ loses that tribal protection, he has to find another tribe. He goes on that journey. He finds the Aus and the Khazraj, the people of Medina, and he is able to move to Medina. And then we have the 10 years in Medina, all of the wars that occur, or the war with all of the battles that occur between the Muslims in Medina and the Quraysh in Mecca, and of course the ultimate conquest. There's a really particular moment, we talked about this, I'm going to connect back to our first lecture, where after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, you have the big three battles between the Prophet ﷺ in Medina and the people and the Quraysh in Mecca, Badr, Uhud, Khandaq. After that, they go to make Hajj. The whole events of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah happen. This is a really important point for our history, because at this point, you get a change. The Prophet ﷺ is now, he's the powerful figure in Arabia. Quraysh are making treaties with him. You don't make treaties with people who are not at least your peers, your equals. Right? Things are changing. It's in that moment that we go back to the story that we were talking about in the last lecture, where the Prophet ﷺ starts reaching out to all of the tribes of Arabia. They say within a couple of years, the Ummah doubles in size. Right? 19 years of history before the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and 2 years after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and you get the same number of conversions. Right? At least doubles in size is what the reports say. So Islam is spreading rapidly in Arabia. And then at this time, the Prophet ﷺ starts to send letters to the great empires surrounding the Arabian Peninsula. We talked about this with Heraclius last week. Prophet ﷺ sends a letter to Heraclius, the emperor of Rome. He sends a letter to Khusro, the emperor of Persia. He sends a letter to the king of Abyssinia and Najashi, who so much can be said about. May Allah bless him. The only one of them to take that letter and actually accept Islam. He sends a letter to the king of Oman, and he sends a letter to the Roman governor of Alexandria. Alexandria at the time was under Roman control, and it had a governor, but its governor was a very powerful entity. So Prophet ﷺ treats him almost as if he's his own state. And we talked about Heraclius' response. Heraclius actually, there are Sahih Hadith reports that talk about how Heraclius accepts Islam. He knows immediately that this is the truth. He converts to Islam, but then all of his Roman nobles come to him and say, if you do this, you will destroy the Roman Empire, there will be massive rebellion against you, we'll throw you out, and so ultimately he recants his conversion, and he goes back to Christianity. It's a tragic story because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him a really blessed life and allowed him to see the truth and to know it when he saw it. But in the end, he wasn't able to give up that power. He dies as a disbeliever. Khusro, the emperor of the Sassanid Empire, the Persian Empire at the time, immediately tears up the Prophet's letter when he receives it and humiliates the Prophet's messenger and says terrible things about the Prophet ﷺ, who is this Arab living in the desert who thinks that he can speak to me, the emperor of Persia, like this. And the Prophet ﷺ says when he hears a report of this, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will tear up his empire just as he tore up my letter. And in response to Heraclius, the Prophet ﷺ said, he respected our message and he was noble with his guests, meaning with my messenger, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will preserve his empire. And Najashi, of course, accepts Islam, and the Prophet ﷺ actually prays janazah over him in his absence, because he dies in Abyssinia. And the prefect, or the governor of Alexandria, actually takes the letter of the Prophet ﷺ. He doesn't become Muslim, but he takes the letter of the Prophet ﷺ, he puts it in an ivory box, and he stores it in the treasures of Alexandria. He treats it very well, and then he sends beautiful gifts to the Prophet ﷺ. So he deals very well with the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ says, Allah will bless the land of this man because of how he treated my message and my messengers. And of course, Egypt becomes one of the most beautiful parts of the Muslim world, and is still such an essential part of our Ummah. Of course, and I'll skip all the way to the end, we come to the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And there's all the beautiful stories, tragic and beautiful stories that surround the death of the Prophet ﷺ. But there's one story that occurs shortly after that that is particularly beautiful, and that really shows the relationship that our Ummah has with the Seerah and with this moment, the beginning of our history. And it's a story where one day Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, during his Khilafah, he goes to Umar, radiallahu anhu, and he tells him, let's go and visit Ayman. Ayman is Barakah, the caretaker of the Prophet ﷺ. She was with him from the moment he was born until after his death. She's an Abyssinian, she was a Abyssinian slave girl who had come to Mecca with the armies of Abraha, with the armies of the elephant, when they had come to attack Mecca. And when those armies were defeated, she ends up being left in Mecca. She becomes a slave girl in Mecca, and ultimately she's gifted to the Prophet ﷺ when he's born. And the Prophet ﷺ frees her, and she becomes his caretaker, or she's his caretaker from when he's born until he dies. Right? The Prophet ﷺ says of Ayman, the Prophet ﷺ says of Ayman that she's the only mother I ever knew. She was his mother for all intents and purposes. Beautiful relationship. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq is the Khalifa of this massively expanding empire. By the time, we'll talk about this next week, inshallah. Under Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, they're conquering the Persians, they're conquering the Romans, they're taking over the world. Right? He's the Khalifa, and he goes to Umar and he says, let's go and visit Ayman, because that's what the Prophet used to do. Right? He's going to visit this Abyssinian former slave woman who doesn't have any status in the politics of this society. So they go to visit her, and they sit down with her, and they're talking to her, and she starts to cry. And they say, yeah, Ayman, why are you crying? Is it because you fear that you're coming to the end here? Because you shouldn't cry about that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the rewards for you are going to be endless. You shouldn't be afraid of that. And she says, I'm not crying because I'm afraid of the end of my life. She's an old woman at this point. She says, I'm crying because we used to have revelation coming down from the skies on us. And since the Prophet ﷺ died, that's been shut off. And Umar and Abu Bakr both start crying with her. And it shows what it must have been like to be part of that community that wasn't just a historical community of the world, like other communities that we read about, but a community that had a direct line of connection to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They had angels coming down into their community all the time. They literally had angels walking amongst them. They had a prophet who was able to tell them about what was going on in the communities of jinn, and who was able to tell them about communities that came before and communities that would come in the future. They had a connection to something none of us can have in any form other than what's been preserved for us in the hadith and in the Quran. And then the Prophet ﷺ dies, and that connection is cut off. And they're left to be just another historical community on the world, living on the surface of this earth without any of that divine, active divine nourishment. And so I love that story because it shows us something of what we all have lost with the death of the Prophet ﷺ, but what we have to always continuously try and stay connected to. And from here on out, we're going to be learning about the very worldly history of the community of Rasulullah ﷺ. It takes place very much in the very real, hard, harsh world with all of those difficult realities. We're not going to be learning about a perfect, beautiful, angelic community. We're going to be learning about a community where there was infighting, there was civil war, there was oppression, there was difficulty. But there was also these beautiful veins of beauty running throughout it. And we're going to learn both of those, inshallah, and it's going to help us to get a better understanding of our position in the timeline of the Ummah, inshallah. So, Jazakumullah khairan. I think I went a couple of minutes over my time there. May Allah bless all of you. And I think we have time for questions. If,
Yeah, we don't have, we have this room until